And this is the time when, we're sort of greeting people with our smiles and
Right.
welcoming people to the webinar. It's that moment when I never know quite what to do. It's like the pre-webinar time. I do see that the participant number is growing and growing and growing, and so obviously we will wait for people to be able to join. But here we are, coming to everyone from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That's where I am, and Goshen, Indiana, and that's where Ann Hostetler is. And we are, by way of pre-introduction, very excited to be together in this Zoom conversation with all of you who are in the process of joining. And I see the numbers continuing to rise, so we're not going to start yet, but we are happy to be here tonight with all of you. It is a beautiful evening in Philadelphia. Um, and
So
how,
how,
please.
sorry, how has interest been in the show that you're doing, Warren and Jane's Painting and Poetry?
We have been just um, over the moon pleased with the response, both in terms of the quantity of visitors, so the galleries have been crowded, people are coming to the show,
Right.
and by the depth of the engagement. And we see people in the galleries, really stopping and looking, reading the poems thoughtfully, and you can see people shifting back and forth. We deliberately set it up so that there's space between the poems and the paintings. We didn't want them to be on top of each other,
Right.
but we did want them to feel, we wanted there to be that energy of connection, but also, create a distinct sort of space for each thing. And so we see people navigating that in the galleries, which is exciting to see. I think Anne, I think I am going to start by
Okay.
welcoming everyone to a Zoom webinar of Woodmere Art Museum. My name is Bill Valerio, and this is a special program with Ann Hostetler that is designed to illuminate a dimension of a show that's on view at Woodmere, Hearing the Brush, the painting and poetry of Warren and Jane Rohrer, on view through July 10th. And we hope that as many of you who are on this call can come to Philadelphia and see the exhibition. It is deeply satisfying as an experience. Warren and Jane Rohrer are, built into the DNA of the community spirit and the arts of Philadelphia. Jane is a friend, both personally and a friend of the institution of Woodmere. And we are deeply honored to present the show. I like to acknowledge a person who is a shared friend of Anne and of Woodmere's, and that is Julia Spricker Kasdorf, who, like Anne, is a poet who comes from a Mennonite descent, Mennonite background, and has built a sort of universe of understanding around not only their own poetry, but the poetry of the Mennonite community. And the idea for a show that brought that brought Warren Rohrer's paintings together with Jane Rohrer's poetry came to us through Julia and her colleague, also my friend Chris Reed, professor of English and art history at Penn State University with Julia. And together they introduced us to Anne, who is an extraordinary person, who's a poet, first of all, a professor emerita at Goshen College, who was the chair of the English department and creative writing. She is the author of 2 books of her own poetry. One of them is Safehold Poems, and another is Empty Room with Light. Ann is the editor of the online Journal of Mennonite Writing, and that can be found at mennonitewriting.org. And she's the editor of the anthology A Cappella Mennonite Voices in Poetry, which includes the poetry of Jane Rohrer and many others, gathering Mennonite poets together under the roof of a single publication. And if that were not impressive enough, Ann is also the founder of the Painted Glass Press, which published the reprint of Jane Rohrer's book, Life After Death, Poems by Jane Rohrer. This was published in 2022, so it's hot off the press. Ann wrote the introduction, and I strongly encourage you to buy the book. It's a gorgeous book. I mean, gorgeous physically in terms of design, but the poems are amazing. It can be obtained at woodmereartmuseum.org through the museum store, or through the Palmer Museum website as well. And I encourage you to simply pick up the phone and ask to speak to Stephen in Woodmere's museum store, and a copy of the book will be at your doorstep in no time. So let me say that this is going to be an incredibly exciting evening for us all. We are recording this Zoom webinar. We encourage that you please put questions in the Q&A. And if you have a question that you would like to engage with Ann in real time, Ann has suggested that be encouraged, that this can be a dialogue. So I would ask you just to indicate. I'll be watching the Q&A, and Hildy Tao, Woodmere's Director of Education, will be monitoring the Q&A. And if you say, can I ask this question of Ann right now? And then ask the question, we will insert the question into the flow of the evening. Let me mention one more thing, that on this coming Saturday, May 14th, from 10 o'clock to noon, Julia Kasdorf, who I've spoken about already, is offering a workshop at Woodmere. And it's a workshop that's all about writing about art. And I feel that I know Julia well enough to describe that it's going to be a very rich and deep and beautiful experience for everyone who participates in that workshop. So I encourage you to check that out online, register, and participate in Julia's workshop this weekend, which is going to be very special. With that, thank you all for joining us. I'm going to shut off my video and hand the webinar over to Ann. And let me say thank you, Ann, for agreeing to be with us tonight at Woodmere. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Really appreciate it. I am thrilled to be here to talk about Jane's poetry. And I do not mean to ignore Warren's art, which is a big part of the show as well, but my focus is going to be Jane. I'd love to thank the people at Woodmere. Have been wonderful. I've worked with Hildy Tao, Steve Kersner in the bookstore, Bill, and Julia. I'd like to give her special thanks for involving me with this program. Julia Spiker Kasdorf, that is, who's doing the poetry workshop on Saturday. She's fantastic. You won't want to miss it. And so many other people who have contributed to promoting Jane's work. So I'm going to switch over to my slideshow here, but you'll probably still be able to see and hear me. And I will begin. This picture here on this book, you see, I think if you can see my cursor, not sure.
Anne, we're not
Yes.
seeing your screen.
Pardon?
We're not seeing your screen.
Okie doke. Let's see if I can fix that here. I'm pretty sure I know what I did. I forgot to push the share screen button, so now I will do that. And see if I can get this up. Okay, so
Thank you.
great. Now I wanted to actually back up a slide. Let's see if I can get to the previous slide. There we go. All right. Thank you. So hopefully the logistics are taken care of. This is the new book we were talking about with Jane's. It's a reprint of Jane's first poems, completely, the cover completely redesigned by John and Prilla, her son and daughter-in-law. And this is actually Jane, Warren, and their two sons, part of the design. As we said, the book is in the bookstore, and this is not like a sales event, but it's just been a delight working on this book. And if you love the poems, I think you will enjoy it. Jane has a second smaller collection, a chapbook called Acquiring Land. And some of the poems I'll be talking about are also in this volume. Something that makes it special is that there is a little interview with her granddaughter at the end, which is really informative and also very affectionate and forthright, as Jane always is. This is kind of where things got started for me in working with Jane's poetry, but I got to know her much sooner. This is a collection from University of Iowa Press. It's probably about 20 years old now, but when I finished my graduate work at University of Pennsylvania, I had just discovered that there were other Mennonites writing poetry. I knew Jane was writing poetry. I had met her earlier, but it was like a movement. Julia Spiker Kasdorf, Jeff Gundy, people in Canada. And being a poet from that background, I knew nothing about it. And I thought, well, I need to find all this work. So that was my prompt. Then after my dissertation was finished, to collect the work. And when I was doing that work, I discovered that Jane really is one of the three women pioneers of publishing poetry for writers from Mennonite background. And these women didn't know each other at first. They were working independently, but they were also, it's a product, education, time, need, creativity. And so there are 24 poets in all. Again, it sounds like I'm doing a sales thing, but it was really, it's kind of a place. It's like a place where I could put writers and you could see them converse with each other. Okay. Jane is a remarkably attractive woman, and it is remarkably hard to find pictures of her. This one I grabbed off the net, and it looks like she is reading a poem. And this probably was maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago or so. But I liked it very much. So I'm going to leave the picture up here where I tell you a little bit about my background with Jane. First time I met Jane Rohrer, I was in my 20s, a little while ago, living in New York City, trying to figure out how to be an artist and a writer while living on the Upper East Side on a publishing assistant's work schedule and salary. This was in the late 1970s, so still doable, but a stretch. And at least once I'd take the train home to Philadelphia to visit my family. On one of those occasions, my mother invited me to come along to a dinner party with several couples that she considered to be Mennonite artists and intellectuals. Especially, she thought I would like to meet this couple, Jane and Warren Rohrer. My parents were from Mennonite background, and they came a long way in their lives through higher education. My father was a professor at Temple University. My mom worked on her PhD while I was in high school. Not your typical, as you would, I don't know if there's a typical Mennonite, but the only barns and farms and buggies in my background were a generation or so back or over to the cousin side. But sometimes my parents would try to show me that there could be Mennonite art, and I was usually like, no, I don't think so. So I wasn't that impressed by the promise of Mennonite artists, but my mother assured me that Warren's work was well known, shown in galleries in New York and Philadelphia, and that Jane herself was a creative and resourceful woman who could sew anything as well as a New York fashion designer. When the striking couple made an entrance into the room, the power of their presence was palpable. Jane was an incredibly beautiful woman with Jackie Onassis style. I remember her wearing a tailored wool cape. When I had a chance, I asked her if she still sewed. She looked at me a bit surprised and said, "No, I write poetry now." It turned out that her sons were only a few years older than I was, and she told me proudly of their accomplishments in art, design, and music. I told her about a favorite short story writer we'd published at Doubleday where I was working, and offered to send her some books. We weren't in touch again for several decades, but I never forgot Jane. More than 20 years later, I'd write to her again after the publication of her first book and ask if I could include her work in an anthology of poetry by Mennonite writers I was working on. Jane was among the first Mennonite poets to publish in literary magazines, but when I contacted her in the late 1990s, she was far more consumed by managing the legacy of her husband's art career. He had passed away in 1995, the year that Sheep Meadow Press had published her first book, Life After Death, then with her own poems. But I had read Jane's book and I believed that the world needed her poems. So today I'm thrilled to be the publisher of a small press that has reprinted her first volume. Jane Turner was born in Broadway, Virginia, into a Mennonite family, the second child, first daughter of 6 children. Her father, something of an outlier as he didn't come from a traditional Mennonite family, raised Tennessee walking horses. Her more religious mother trained her in the domestic arts. In high school, she was able to escape the pressures of home by attending for a few years Eastern Mennonite High School as a boarding student. Upon graduation, she went home for a year to help her mother with her new little brother, and then went to Eastern Mennonite College in Harrisonburg, Virginia, where she met Warren Rohrer, who was headed for the pastorate. While in college, he discovered a passion for art. Jane was all in favor, and the couple married in November 1948, before either of them had finished college. To tie her life to that of a chosen man was for a woman in the post-war 40s and the 50s to gamble on her fortune. Jane and Warren made their fortune together. After their marriage in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where Warren taught in an elementary school for a year, the couple returned to Virginia so Warren could finish his education. Jane worked as a secretary in the dean's office and as a receptionist, trying to make enough to live on so that Warren could build his artist skills, teach, and network in summer classes. Jane is fond of saying they ganged up and ran away from their restrictive Mennonite backgrounds and families. But while they distanced themselves from the piety and legalism of their religious upbringing, Warren and Jane held on to and repurposed the aspects they valued. A love of land and attachment to place, the project of marriage and family as a shared enterprise, and the integration of values into daily life. After all, one doesn't run away unless one is threatened by serious claims on one's identity and loyalties. One simply leaves. When they moved to a farm in Christiana, PA in 1961, near Warren's family roots, they were looking for an economical place to live that would provide ample studio space for Warren and their 2 growing boys. But they were also looking for a way of life that integrated their artistic visions with their vision of a family in harmony with agricultural rhythms. Although they rented out the fields to local farmers and Warren commuted to Philadelphia to teach at the University of the Arts, Jane gardened and preserved much of their food. They renovated the barn to serve as Warren's studio, and Jane was an active companion in discussing his painting, including the giving of titles to his works. As her sons grew up and left for their own adventures, Jane turned to writing poetry in a serious manner. Earlier, she had shown a talent for writing in a poem she published in a church newsletter she had started in the first year of her marriage in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The poem, printed in Julia Spiker Kasdorf's essay, Truths of a Woman's Life in the Education of Poet Jane Rohrer, available in field language, the catalog for this show, demonstrates an open mind and a frank assessment of the situation that would characterize Jane's later work, according to Spiker Kasdorf. But family life and partnership had left her little time for pursuing her art. I really didn't realize one could pick up a pencil to write a poem until I was in my 40s, she told her granddaughter Willa. My granddaughter is Willow, her granddaughter is Willa, included in the back of Acquiring Land. During the 1970s, she joined a writing group in the nearby city of Lancaster and eventually accompanied Warren to Philadelphia, auditing classes with Thomas Kinsella at Temple University and with Stephen Berg at the University of the Arts. In one of his workshop classes, Jane offered a poem for critique. Steve Berg was so impressed that he sought more work from her and eventually published some of it, including this poem in the American Poetry Review, which he edited. This poem shows Jane dealing with her uncomfortable family life and complex relationship with the Mennonite community of her origins. Mennonite Funeral in the Shenandoah Valley. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Proverbs 22:6. I could never reach this place, but for a memory of Christmas that plays at the edge of the winter in my mind. Beside me in the long hallway, my father chokes softly. He is down now from the black horse and back from the worldly track he rode in widening circles away from her. In the front parlor, she has drawn her circle around her. Still and unreachable, she receives the favored. So nice of you to come. Outside on the curved driveway, we must all fit somehow on this natural occasion. My aunts, her secular sisters, sit in black cars, smoothing on their gloves, finger by inspected finger. In the way of things, I wait with him in some other black car until the column uncouples, awake behind her bell coach, inching ahead. Soundless, we creep. We crawl to the last place and couple obedient in line under the old pines that sigh, as in memory. More of her people wait. So nice of you to come. I watch her gain the plain doorway, that eye of needle, and move regally up the gray aisle under pink roses without her crutch. We wait in a room strangled of air and listen to the clock choke. Mustiness lingers in odor of pamphlet and Sunday vest. The light, unstained, lies in blocks on the cold floor. We, the uneven hem of her earthly garment, are pleated to fit the short front pew. Breath, I cannot breathe this death. I hear the varnished pulpit say, dearly beloved, and you who have left the faith, and this saint. Her pink fragrance is paling now, and this is bitter bread, O day in my sweet life. Going home, going home. I take my place with the unforgiven, see her folded into that satin cathedral. O strange return, O train up a child, O child. This is not Jane's farm, but it's a picture of farmland in Broadview, Virginia, the area that Jane grew up in. It's a little bit different than Lancaster County because it has those mountains. In solidarity with Warren's acts of looking, Jane looks at the world too, often at the same fields, the same vistas, with a vision that allows space for his too. But her point of view, which often includes Warren's presence, offers a radically different perspective. This is the farmhouse that they moved to in Christiana, Pennsylvania. I took a visit there a couple years ago. The person they sold it to is still living there. And here's a picture of the barn. That's not Warren's car, but it was repurposed for a studio and also for use as a garage and a shed. Okay, in Farm in My Mind, Jane revisits both her attachment to and need for separation from her past, using the metaphor of geography. She refers to upper and lower fields, which actually existed on the Christiana farm, as a metaphor for the coexistence of the present moment, the upper field, and the subconscious or the past, lower field in her mind. Farm in My Mind. Most of the time they stay in the lower field. I hear their voices, intermittent, like bulletins issued from the radio. Once my mother came near my house and on a table spread the objects of her life, flowers dried and taken from old books. Quiet and bending over, she gestured unrecognizably. Most of the time, I live in an upper field. The sun shines warm as approval. Rain baptizes the shingles, and what the people do, they do. Noise comes out and rounded O's, hello, hello. Children laugh from high in the orchard. They go away, but send their voices back. Everywhere is the upper field. Here's a picture of the lower field looking down from the barn. The two fields of the poem contain the past and present, existing in tandem, a theme that's re-echoed in some of her poems of mourning, this whole idea of being in two places at once or having several places within you. The everywhere of the upper field contains the lower field as well. The poet can go into the upper field at any time, but she seems reluctant, or maybe she isn't even quite able to visit the lower field on her own. You'll see these fields echoed again in some of her other poems. In the kitchen before dinner, we're offered a domestic setting as a place of contemplation. I remember when this came out in the American Poetry Review, there was a whole raft of her poems, about 7 or 8 in there. And I think it was in the early 80s. I carried it around with me like a talisman. I love this poem. It's my favorite. And maybe because I like the kitchen, I don't know. In the kitchen before dinner. The winter sky past the feeder, beyond the wood of straight trees and the field rising to the ridge is unnervingly delicate. But you are acquainted with the country and you know poems. You've heard this. Years and years I've looked out from this window, stirring straight out of the sun. A cardinal swoops to the feeder. His sweep, not his shape, the unstrokable wing of art. Seeing that, I want to tell you, the son of poems is on the snow, on the slope past the wood to the pond, what I see at 5 o'clock. It marries the music from my living room. It is not that simple. I cannot explain it. Saying that, I think I cannot ever leave. I'm grounded by attachment. I'm rapacious for facts. That bowl, his gloves on the chair, holding each other. These I can explain. Separated from her beloved companion, who's temporarily elsewhere, the poet composes a tableau, a scene in which every object takes on a numinous presence. Jane's verbal art paints this tableau collaboratively with the reader, transforming the flight of a cardinal into the unstrokable sweep of art. Unlike the beloved, the cardinal is untouchable. But here, the poet prefers the tangible. I'm rapacious for facts, this bowl, his gloves on the chair. You know, her desire makes us see them and feel them. To also notice there's a lot of you in this poem, you, and I thought, well, it's really kind of Warren, isn't it? But it's also the reader. She's like reaching out to us. She's saying, well, you've heard this, you know this, I want to tell you this. You know, this is what I want to say to you. So there's an intimacy, I think, with the reader, as well as an implied love note to her partner. In the field language digital companion video, Language and Land, poet Julia Spiker-Kasdorf says of the Rohrers, it's clear that they are both working from the same world. Then she poses the questions invited by the juxtaposition of their work. How do you translate experience into something visual? How do you translate experience into something verbal? So here's that kitchen window. I think the kitchen was renovated since the Rohrers lived there, but you can see down to the field and the pond from the window. And there is, just trying to think, there is a painting in the show that Warren did of this, but the picture of it has like these two little gingerbread houses on it. And I decided I was just going to give you the poem for that one. This one, we'll look at the poem first, and then we'll look at the poem painting pairing, because I want to give Jane's poem full chance to create its images in your mind before we go to the conversation with the painting. One of the techniques that I think both Jane and Warren use is this technique of layering. And in Warren's paintings, you see there's often a thick impasto or a texture with something else painted under and something else underneath. So there's physical layers. In Jane's poetry, there are layers of perspective. So we shift around and look at things, whereas a painting is a thing to be looked at. The arts are different in that way. In the studio, draws the reader into layers of looking, complicating what it means to see. The title of the poem reminded me of Christina Rossetti's poem In an Artist's Studio, which she wrote to her brother, the pre-Raphaelite painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who was famous for painting these big hair women. And in fact, his wife, Elizabeth Siddall, committed suicide and died. And for some reason, they had to dig up her coffin and her hair had just grown all around her. So kind of morbid, but this whole idea that the woman is the object of art, this was not how Warren painted. And it's kind of fun because here Jane is in the studio, and if anything, she's painting Warren. He is brushing stroke by rose madder stroke on the clean ground of the canvas. The documentary filmmaker leans close, his big camera obscuring his head. The local newspaper photographer leans into the space behind the filmmaker, adjusts his lens, and photographs the filmmaker filming the artist's painting. I am a camera. This is your picture of what I see. Now you are in the picture, and behind you stands one who sees the whole thing. And behind him, his ear close, hearing the brush. To portray the artist who is focused on the painting, the poet switches from sight to hearing, his ear close, hearing the brush. Vision is the most analytical sense, hearing the most spiritual. The hushed sound of brush at the poem's end grants privacy to the painter in the midst of all this scrutiny, demonstrating that the artist is attuned to a world we cannot see, even though he paints it for our vision. In the studio, by shifting the sense of sight to the sense of hearing, opens our awareness to the fact that Warren's experience as an artist is inaccessible even to his most intimate partner. saved through his paintings. And I also think about his listening to the brush in terms of his family's deafness. His paternal grandparents and his brother were both deaf. And in fact, his father at one point tried to start an ASL church service. So this idea of the senses, vision, hearing, one compensating for the other, this is part of Warren's experience. He also was not a man of few words. He was articulate, but he was not a chatterbox, to put it lightly. I also like the way the you is used in this poem. This is your picture of what I see. That's what a poem is. That's what an image poem is. Now you are in the picture. So she's placing us right there in the middle of her picture. This is in the Woodmere show. This is the painting of Warren's. It's paired with Jane's poem. And except for one poem in this series, none of Jane's poems are about the painting. They're not ekphrastic poems in that sense, but they are artists' conversations. And I think that, the gallerist has done a brilliant job, was that you, Bill, of pairing the paintings and the poems in such a way to bring out conversations in your mind between what you see and what you read. Warren's paintings are notoriously hard to represent on camera because they flatten out, but more than likely this is a layered painting with depth, and you can see the shaded gradations, textures, and so forth that are happening here. And rose madder is one of the colors that would have been used in producing especially the upper part of the painting. Making Hay is another poem that is in fact kind of a compliment in the studios, because it's also about Jane watching, she's actually holding a painting and somebody's taking a picture of it while she's standing there looking across at the hayfield. So again, we've got some layers in this poem. Making Hay. Things come into focus during the afternoon as I stand behind the large painting, holding the brace steady against a playful wind. I hear the camera click as he photographs the whole picture, then walks up close and details converging rows of color. We are on a broad, flat place near the barn in late haze, ideal for photographing and for making hay. I see John enter the alfalfa field with a 6-mule team, pulling a gasoline engine and a bulky baler to begin working the windrows, the whole contrivance crossing the field in the lockstep rhythm of an old poem. The first bale hangs at the top of the chute. John's son pulls it down and stacks it at the back of the wagon. The little girl tugs at it also. Her dress is the purple of the painting's edge, where the hay green dissolves. Sorry, her dress is the purple of the painting's edge where the hay green dissolves. I am thinking of cows in winter chewing and of the idea of the cud. To portray the artist who is focused on the painting, the poet switches from, okay, I'm sorry, I am in the wrong place here. I'm trying to skim over a little bit of this so that I can talk to you and not just read, but then I make mistakes, so forgive me. The poet notes the photographer taking a close-up of the painting's edge, then shifts her gaze to watch John, the farmer, baling hay with his children. She's giving us a little family portrait of cooperation. It's like a painting within a painting, or a poem within a poem here. She links this image to Warren's painting by noticing that the little girl's dress is the purple of the painting's edge where the hay green dissolves. And I'm going to show you, this is a painting from, the show was at the Palmer Gallery at Penn State. This painting is big, and there's lots of texture in it. And you can see that best when you look at the edges. So when you go look at Warren's paintings, make sure to look at the edges, because you're going to see a lot of activity. So you far away, it just looks like a field. You come close, it's like going into the patches of unmown grass on my lawn, where there are insects, where the birds like to come, where there's all kinds of flowers and things growing. There's life. And I also think there's a little joke in that poem, because when you're making hay, you make hay while the sun shines, right? As the cliche goes, because you don't want it to rain on your hay or it spoils, but also kind of means making money. So it's a couple ways to make money from hay, and one way is to make paintings of it, right? So. And at the end, poet's almost chewing her words. She's thinking of the cows chewing in the winter, and the idea of the cud, which is something that chews, like the cows swallow it and bring it back up. It's like the chewing gum that never quits. The ruminating and the chewing, just like, you know, reading a poem and coming back, and looking at a painting and coming back and coming back. Well, exploring the difference in their arts through her poetry, Jane used the space of that difference to explore the passion she felt for her husband through a long devoted marriage. And I just think, you know, the way it's written, their marriage is, you know, the envy of everybody who reads this book. One might read almost all of her poems as love letters to her husband, whether by reference to their shared world or more directly. In the Gear Shift poem, it is explicit. I wrote an article about these three Mennonite women poets who I thought were the pioneers in my a cappella book. And they're all like really into sex and marriage, sensuality, celebrating the body. I don't know if they got this from the Mennonites or not, but it's kind of cool. The Gear Shift poem. Oh, first, here's a conversation, making hay with a different making hay poem. And I can't wait to see this. I have not seen this, unfortunately, this exhibit in person, but I'm going to in a few weeks. So I'm really pumped about that. The Gear Shift poem. This is an early painting by Warren. I think the poem, if I date it right by using some internal evidence, I think the poem was written about 10 years later. The Gear Shift poem. If I look at his hand on the gear shift, my thighs will open. My palm will settle to his thick wrist, feel which way to move, down the back of his hand to the skin tip, up his sleeve to rough jacket, shoulder, shirt, neck, hair, black bouncing, to my hand sending messages to my whole self here in the car. After 28 years, it is still happening. If his hand ever, now gliding level, first to window, then to radio lights, I will stroke it thinking yes, and wanting not to cage him in habit. Here are some interiors of the studio, the barn studio at in Christiana, Pennsylvania. A few years from the date of that poem, Warren would be diagnosed with lymphocytic leukemia, and it would eventually take his life, but not for around another 15 years. So he had to live with this health condition for quite a while. They decided to move from Christiana around 1980 and relocated to Mount Airy, where they purchased and renovated Lower Cogsley, the former studio of artist Violet Oakley. Although its setting is far more urban than that of Christiana, the property has the gracious feel of an estate with gardens abutting Fairmount Park and a long driveway. The second floor studio's high ceilings and windows echo those of the barn studio, but in a more refined manner. So give you here, we are in the studio at Lower Cogsley, and it's now renovated to be a living space and a studio for graphic design. So it's probably a little bit more refined than when Warren worked there, but I think it's interesting. You know, artists of big paintings need these big spaces with lots of light. Meanwhile, and here's the front of the house. It's really hard to get a picture of the whole house, but this is the way it looks looking out from the pillars, and you'll see an interior or so a little bit later. Meanwhile, there were a few more years to write poems and shovel snow in Christiana. Here's another one, Jane playing with states of mind, Zen poem. I am here in the highest story of my house, looking out for the snowplow. We've been snowed in for days, and one priority has superseded an entire list. To move about in the world. Look at the pond. It has a matte surface, gray. The snow melted in before it froze solid, and then sleet coated it. It's the sleet that hobbles the plows. Friends grow wise in the city. They call and say the country must be beautiful. It is beautiful. As far as the eye can see, it is beautiful. Nothing crosses her despotic beauty. I go down where it is warm, I say. One is always bound, if not by snow, accumulations. He says, don't get philosophical, hands me a shovel and says, shovel. We go out where it is cold and shovel. This painting, Mauve Shift, has the feel of a snowdrift in twilight, I think. I'm going to go back here for a moment. No, I'm not. I'm going to go forward. It seems that some of Jane's poems I don't have an actual date for some of these poems, but they become freighted with imagery of mortality. Orchard in the spring. I am shaking like a leaf in the orchard. Green parachutes are caught in the trees. A lace drapes the crabapple. On the ground, thick prune branches lie in disarray, waiting. I am not waiting. If you are calling me, I am over here, staring at the ground where fallen cuttings meet and pass, and a short-lived face appears as a shadow on the blowing grass. I am sad in the white drizzle of blossoms. Elmer in the lower field bobs along atop the plow, drawn by a 6-mule team, opening a furrow, closing it, opening, closing the livelong day. I lie down in the grass and look up. Now I am waiting. Someone I know is that dried apple holding on since last fall. Soon a green shoot will push it from the limb to the ground. Going back to that middle stanza, there's a couple of places, one in I think it's in the Making Hay poem in here, where she refers to this motion of the plow, opening a furrow, closing it, opening it, closing it. And in the 1990s discussion with Mennonite arts and intellectuals, a piece of it is transcribed and edited on MennoniteWriting.org. If you click on the word journal, you can get back to the archived issues, and there's a whole issue on Warren and Jane, but that transcript is there. Talks about this word boustrophodon, which is also mentioned in the field language catalog, a word that Warren fell in love with. And it is, I think it comes from Virgil's Georgics, but it's the idea of a poem that goes back and forth along the rows, like the plow. And here again, they're still in Christiana, probably getting ready to leave. The painting is actually from a decade later, so you can see Warren is still quite productive when they moved to Mount Airy. But we're back in that kitchen. reading at breakfast. So possible green the spring, so green the farm I thought we'd leave. He reaches for his cup and I touch his hand. More coffee? He looks up from his stack of papers, the Sunday Times, an art book, blank-faced. The art book says the last painting's been painted, says this yellow quiet corner tilts above a final abyss, even while bottles on the cell, the nasturtiums and the time are the same, and I see his face change. They come still down the long lane of his mind, dumb things, crude images in drifting light, shuffling toward the surface, dazzling, awkward, oblivious. So I think of that as another portrait of Warren deep in thought, Jane guessing at what he's thinking. Even in people so close, there is a separation that you really can never cross. And that's kind of what keeps things interesting, if you're so inclined. But I think there's this, Julia Spiker Kasdorf told me that this poem was read at Warren's memorial service. And so I think of it as a kind of elegy here to their time at in Christiana. The move to Mount Airy was in some ways a welcome one for Jane, freeing her from the farm work she had willingly undertaken in her younger years. Remember, canning, preserving, make jelly, having a huge garden, ton of work. I'm just trying to decide if I'm even going to put mine in. I'm going to Greece. I have a daughter getting married. Garden? I have a good farmer's market, but there's something once you've dug in the earth that kind of compels you. But you can also say, I'm done with that. It was time also laden with anxiety, the spinning out of hope, the awareness that the love of her life was mortal. As a poet, it gave her further opportunity to reflect on the dance between places and distance in memory. Let's look at this poem, Metaphor. Years ago in a writing class, the professor talked about a poet who lost his mind trying to decide whether to live in the city or the country. 20 years I lived on that farm for the look of the orchard and the fields, in the mist, in rain, in snow, and most of all, in blossom, until in loneliness one day I left it and began to long for it, like everybody else. The other day at a party, I heard a single word fall toward me through the talk of friends, like a tree uprooted, crashing through new green growth. Was it orchard? Was it pond? Or simply hill? So she's primed to be triggered by the words for the place that she loved. The gap between the immediacy of the moment and the memory of that moment is the precondition of art. We strive to recreate in words or images moments of presence in which our participation was so total that art making was rendered unnecessary until later, when the moment has evaporated. One thinks of Wordsworth's definition, or at least I do, maybe not everybody, Wordsworth's definition of poetry as a spontaneous overflow of emotion, recollected in tranquility. In the poem's final stanza, the distance between past and present, signifier and signified, collapses into a single overheard word. But instead of giving us the word, the poet keeps us hanging in the in-between space of possibility. Was it orchard? Was it pond? Or simply hill? Warren's Hornet's Nest is an intriguing pairing for this poem. It predates their departure from the farm by over a dozen years. Yet its composition, in which a nest-like shape is surrounded by a field, suggests the possibility of worlds existing within worlds. The final poems I'm going to talk about were written after Warren's passing in 1995. And most of these appear in Acquiring Land, her second book. Now think about, this is seems to be a landscape, but it's also about language. It's about making art. It's about words. Place. The words dappled with sunlight floated across the open field as I drove by. You understand the dapples did not float or the sunlight, just the words, since by that time I had passed and would never see that green instant again. Yet it is cut in permanence and perfect in my most real of archives, a small gallery of moving frames from another place while I am here. And here's a field in Christiana, dappled with sunlight. I think this might be the lower field. And here is the poem painting pairing in the show. Again, beautiful to look at the painting, ponder the poem, read the poem again, ponder the painting. This is Jane's one ekphrastic poem, technically ekphrastic poem in this collection that I'm reading tonight. This is a painting that I believe Warren made for her, or the poem is about a painting that Warren made for her. I'm not quite clear on which. Fields in Snow. You have obviously been here since my last visit, and I like what you've done. But is it landscape or is it art? It's so confusing with you coming from the other side. Calligraphy there on the contours of the field, scribbling in stalks and stacks left from the fall, is visible in the distant upper levels of the canvas, if it is a canvas. But it's the wash of thin white, just a sift of snow. Or is it white that erases the visual samsara and beckons me to you beyond the pale? We've been split like a schist. Here I am, and there you are, parallel. A schist is like it's kind of like a geode, dirt, mud, stone outside the crystal, split, then you open it, and then there is this beautiful hard crystal. Here's another poem painting pairing. Warren did a lot of paintings that either cover over or display this kind of writing. That's where the catalog field language gets its name, these kind of glyphs that, as though Warren felt like he could read the fields. They had their own kind of hieroglyphics. And this is written in the third person, but I think it's her experience, widow. She lived years in grief's exquisite sphere, walking as the oxen walks, who strophed on, in a small field, tended a garden, so miniature you could put it in a safe at night, and took short afternoon strolls on the lawns of her memories. Why, you could hold her and her whole world in one hand and shake it like a snow-filled paperweight. Her mouth opens in a large O. Her eyes register a slowed taking in of the world as she runs out of air in the low wintry light of her permeable shell. But I have come as my name from that safe jail, have clawed through the membrane that was so tight with only my skin against the spacious room in the cold. I am as you at risk of breathing, skittery, windborne, free. Another love poem. Valentine. I will make you a valentine of snow. You can let it melt and dip your fingers in to know how a rivulet felt. Or lift it to your lips to slake a thirst. If you remember sips and thirst and lips. Where you have gone or go, I will send you a valentine of snow in case you do not touch snow now. This is the last poem that I am going to read. It's called Leaving Venice. In her later years, when she emerged from the thickness of her grieving, and with great love comes great sorrow and loss, right? But she emerged and for maybe a decade really enjoyed traveling with her youngest brother, the one she took time off to care for. When he was a little guy and she just finished high school, he became a travel agent and he would take her places with him. And she discovered in traveling a great joy. In her interview with her granddaughter, Willa, she explains, my addiction to travel is because it is an enforced separation from the obligation to do what one is supposed to do at home. I thought, aha, no wonder I love to travel so much. Also, there is that strange phenomenon of feeling connected to any place in the world, no matter how exotic, because one does not have to stay there long enough to unload one's emotional baggage and spoil everything with longing and sadness, she told Willa in an interview. More affirmatively, she states, I have never met a trip I didn't like, and when I am at home, I miss everywhere I've been. Okay, back for a moment. There's Jane though. Hi, Jane. And that's John and Prilla, her oldest son and daughter-in-law, who live in the studio, and that's me. Leaving Venice. I am the one on the back deck of the ship, leaving the canal, the one crying at the opera aria and near to going overboard in the music of the wake churning up. Of what I saw and what I heard, I can say little, or reach back for what I mourn to take it with me. If I had stayed, and we never can, I would have met them all. There would have been teacups and goblets as in the old days. And eventually I would have danced in a long swag of skirt, and Venice would have been as it is in the books written by English women. Attachment would have fastened me to those stone steps I bought and would lose. How contradictory of me. I was hardly there, certainly not long enough to leave. Take my advice. If you go for more than a minute, you will die for its decaying perfection when you leave. You will play the films over and over and do things intensely as though for the last time. You will come to sound like a lonely cello. But then, I am not talking about Venice. So thank you for listening. Thank you, Jane, for writing the poems. If you're here, I hope I did a good enough job reading them. And I'm happy to take questions now. I can't see all of you. I can only see the other members of my webinar. So it's like voices from the void, but please bring them in.
We have thank yous, Anne. I think people have been mesmerized by the poetry and your reading of the poetry. And we've all kind of gone on this quiet journey of thought. And I love the way you discuss the way she puts together the past and the present, and it reminds me so much of Warren's paintings. You were talking about edges. It's in those edges and in the painting, but that you see the kind of the story of the painting. And what's underneath is always resonating forward.
You know, when I was preparing this talk, I saw more of that than I had before. And that's why it's so important when you have to explain something to somebody else you think you already know, because language teaches you things. When you use the words, I think that's a reason for writing poems too. And yeah, I'm so eager to see this show again, because I feel like I know the work and I know the conversation even more, but I still have a lot to learn.
Anne, I want to thank you as well and say, as Hildy did, that your ability to kind of bring the poems and the paintings together was revelatory. Not only your remarks about the edges, but your remarks about the layerings. And it's funny for me because, you know, as an art historian, as somebody who really spends a lot of time with paintings, it's the first thing I see with Warren's paintings is I look for what's the bottom layer, what's the second layer, you know, what's that little bit of red that pops through? Oh, I see that comes in, but you know, you know, I intuitively go into that as a looker at Warren's paintings. You know, I'm less of a reader of poems, and I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little, just again, or a little bit more about how it, you know, I know how I read the layers in the paintings. I wonder if you, as a poet and as somebody who teaches and writes, and to speak more about the layerings in the poems, if you could do that.
Okay, well, I mean, I think that farm poem that I read, and I don't think it's in your show, but it's in the Life After Death book, but that I think it's called Farm Scene or something, Farm in My Mind. And she's got the upper field and the lower field. So that's a very simple kind of layering. And she uses metaphor more than you would think for such a plain spoken writer. But that one is there as the farm in its elevations becomes a metaphor for it's going. Of course, she can walk in the lower field, but she don't want to go into that lower field. You know, that layer is covered with the new one. And so I think it's more metaphorical with the poet. Another place I first noticed it was in the studio, where she's talking about all these layers of looking. And it cracks me up because I like to look at the same kind of thing. You know, it's like, here's Warren painting his painting, and here's the documentarian, and here's a newspaper photographer taking a picture of him. And you think, well, how many cameras are we going through? And then she says, well, I'm a camera, and you're actually in my picture, and now you're looking too. So this way that we think there's one perspective, but there's actually another, and then another, and then another. Or you even think about how we get dressed in the morning. Most of us are wearing layers. Not all of us, but most of us, right? Even it's just your underwear. And there's a sense about life is, there's covering and modesty and layering. And I think, you know, the past that they came out of, I'm pretty sure there were things that they would like to erase, especially I think Jane, and then there are things that they wanted to keep. And so the layers, like in Warren's painting, it's not a complete covering over, they're little bits or they're little edges. And I've played with doing some ekphrastic writing around Warren's Warren's paintings. It's been very interesting because, of course, they're endlessly suggestive. You know, one is this big, at Penn State, he had this big diptych, two sort of solemn green paintings next to each other. And I just turned them into Amish bishops who were alike but different, you know. And I'm sure he wasn't planning to paint that, but it's like, how did the poem speak to me? And I was doing a lot of research on the Amish part of my father's family at that time. So, you know, both the paintings and the poems can hold layers of the reader's thoughts and experience too. And I think Jane acknowledges that, you know, that you are going to bring things to the poem too. And she gives you space to do that.
I was thinking about it when you were reading the final poem that you meant Leaving Venice. And at the end, which is kind of a stunning moment in the poem where she says, and I'm not talking about Venice,
Right.
that in a way,
Right.
and again, I was kind of entranced by what you were saying, but in a way, Venice is only a layer in that poem.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
just the way there's the poem where she's up looking at, the crabapple clinging to the
Mhm.
branch and it will be pushed away,
Right.
but it's not a crabapple, it's a person. And,
Right.
and so,
Right. Exactly. And we don't know who that is. It could be a sick friend. It could be a parent. It could be Warren. You don't know. And so,
it's
yeah.
life.
But you put yourself in there looking up too.
Yeah.
So no sooner do we have spring and summer, and then you get to August and everything is rotting on your counter, and I said something to my daughter when she said, well, it's the dying month, mother. And I'm like, really? There's a heck of a lot of dying that happens most of the year then, but I think the seasons and the time of year became powerful metaphors for her, maybe for both of them when they were living so close to the land as well.
And there is a question from one of our docents, Eileen. She said you said that Warren was a man of little words and Jane was clearly a woman of words. Do you think that this difference binded them?
Well, you mean it brought them closer together?
I guess.
Yes. I mean, I think so. I think Warren almost relied on Jane to name his paintings. There's plenty of untitles there in the collection. And her titles are good. There's not, they're not too flippant or anything. Sometimes, like a terrible title can ruin a painting or a photograph, depending on how cutesy someone wants to be. And then like, oh my gosh, I thought that was a sophisticated piece of art and it's just a joke. She doesn't do that. I'm not a snob or anything, but But I think that, she was somebody her use of words was precise. Well, she is someone whose use of words is precise and direct. I think they both had this incredible integrity about them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think she was, he was from a family that dealt with deafness quite a bit. And she was from, as far as I know, a hearing family. And she also was, I think words were her paint and her talent too.
Yeah.
And I would offer to you that one of my favorite titles of any painting I know in the world is Big Breathing Mouth. I mean, and my understanding from Jane is that is her title, and that it's such an evocative.
Mm-hmm.
The title itself is a short poem,
Mm-hmm.
and to me, it does to that painting, what you've described so beautifully. The entire show does to every painting where you have these pairings, is that it brings you into a reading of them.
Yeah. We have a question from Julia. She asks, Anne, if you could talk about what you as a poet value in Jane's craft.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I would say that I love both her richness and economy of language, her ability to choose the precise word. And yet, and she draws you juicily into it. Like she can just mention gloves on a chair and you see them in living color with the shape of the hand. And I can tell you what kind of leather they're made. I mean, makes an image in my mind. But she doesn't stay any one place too long, because as soon as you've got the image, she's shifting you somewhere else. So you can follow them. They're subtle. And you can reread them many times without getting tired of them. I would say that's, and some of them it took me a while to understand, and some of them not even sure I do understand. All of them. And I like that because they make me want to come back to them.
Well, two comments from the Rohrer family. One is beautiful. Thank you so much, Anne and Bill. And secondly, commenting, I think, Bill, on you bringing up the title, Big Breathing Mouth, I love you. The Rohrer family is saying, hilariously, Bayard's story came up with that title.
Oh, okay. Corrected.
So someone you know, right?
The person who owned the painting and gave it to Woodmere. So
Oh, that's
thank you.
great. That would be cool. So I will buy your painting if I get to name it. How about that?
It's a beautiful painting.
That's great. Well, I just can't wait to see the show. Like I said, I'm chomping at the bit. So I will be there sometime during the last week of May, I'm sure, because I don't want to wait too long. And I'll be around in the beginning of June as well. So really looking forward to it. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about Jane and her poems and to read them. Nothing I like better than reading a good poem. So
Well, thank you, Anne, for sharing your insights and for sharing your understanding, with all of us, which, it helps, open this world further for all of us. And
that's great.
We're grateful. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. And hi, Rohrer family. I hope I did okay with the wonderful work.
Well, Hildy, are there any more questions in the chat, or
No,
if not?
no, I think people have and the Rohrer family says to you, Anne, love you, thank you. So
that's very sweet. Okay, great.
Very
That's
beautiful.
great. I hope maybe I'll get to pop in and see them too when I'm there. We'll see how it goes. All right. Thank you. Take care, everyone. Good night.
Thank you again, Anne. That was beautiful.
Very welcome.
Have a good night.
Good. Thank you. You too.